Um, Two things I hate doing is talking to an audience and talking about myself, but Andrew persuaded me. A third of a century in emergency medicine, or a third of a century supporting the helicopter. Pleased that the RNLI are here, because they are included, and others who are included in speech have turned up as well. My long-suffering wife is up there, has had to put up with all my antics, impromptu departures and everything. Chris, who's looked after me on many an occasion, many a rescue. Andrew, who used to support, thank you, Chris. Andrew, who used to support, and of course the lifeboat, which I've trained with. Nearly got knocked off the back of one in Loch Inver when they accelerated. I'll look back, a random career in medicine. You see people, and especially these days in medicine, they qualify. But they've got to decide whether they want to be a neurosurgeon or a GP or go into occupational health on the day they qualify, otherwise they don't get onto the run-through training. That's not much fun for them. And they also carefully look down the list of selection. It happened in our day, that enthusiasts went looking down the list of which jobs. Being me, when it came to doing shadows, I went to the top of the list and chose Ashford Hospital, which of course where I met Sharon. And due to a typographical or alphabetical error, I chose Baldry as my consultant, not Adams. Maybe it was given out in order of seniority. And then I went on to do pathology. I've had an interest in pre-hospital care since I did general practice. And as I say, a support of intolerant wives. This is some memories, quirks and bumps in the road for search and rescue and a career. So I qualified in 1982 in St George's, which I got an email this week to say is now City St George's. The alumni has been changed yet again. And after qualifying, I thought I'd go and do my 1 year pre-registration. I thought I'd go into pathology. But noticed that fairly quickly, conversation pathology is quite limited, including the staff. So I changed to general practice, and everyone said, oh, you never go from pathology to general practice, and was accepted on several rotations, and ended up in Pontypridd in South Wales. It's very important at that time because when you're doing your CV, you need a few things on it, and working in a developing country is always helpful, and Wales fitted the bill. Not only that, they live out far west and speak a funny language, so that helped on the way up here. I took an interest in pre-hospital care, and this was a time before the HCPC, so paramedics weren't registered. But I had the good fortune to meet up with Harry Stevens and his friend Tony Evans, who were basically standard ambulance technicians who decided to go for paramedic and work their way up under their own steam to that. Interestingly, Harry used to come up and say, Brian, how do you do this? What do you think of this? Latterly, when he was divisional resuscitation officer for Mid Glamorgan, I used to go up to him and say, Harry, why do you think of this in pre-hospital care? Roles reversed. However, some of the problems at the time are the same as now. Because the old breed of GP, if they turned up for a cardiac arrest, wanted for them to load the patient into the ambulance, and drive off. Not get stuck in and do resus without interruption of cardiac compressions and things. And that's another problem we've got these days. Nowadays, the standard practice is, except in unusual circumstances, you resuscitate until it's beyond hope, or you get a return of circulation. I've had one successful resus in my life. So it doesn't happen very often. And then I got the Diploma of Immediate Medical Care. That was the very first sitting of that exam, which I thought would be quite easy. Well, easy-ish. But the Royal College of Surgeons lived up true to form. The pass rate was 29%, and it probably saved my skin that I did pass, because that was where the fridge freezer went to, paying the exam fees. Arrived in Lewis on the 1st of May, and on the 22nd of June, John Goodall phoned me up and said, I hear you're interested in emergency care. Can you cover the weekend? And those who knew John Goodall in his typical disorganised style said, "Oh, don't worry, they'll never call you." Yeah, heard that one before. And my first job was on the 23rd of June 1990, which was so important that 9 years ago they held the Brexit referendum on that day to celebrate that job. Of course, phoned up the base and to find the helicopter, because I didn't know where they parked it. Got some very helpful advice. Don't drive on come in the back gate, don't drive on the big roads with numbers, they're runways. Good? Yes, Vic Carcass. Who else? For those who know him. So they gave me a whistle-stop tour of where to find the helicopter, and true enough, 8:30 the next morning, I heads up from Coast Guard, and that was my very first mission. Back in those days, medical cover for the helicopter was unique to Stornoway and Sombra. Here, when I joined, there were 5 GPs, a physician and an anaesthetist who's with us. And Sombra had one doctor, a GP, who covered their helicopter. And interestingly, even back in the 80s, he was a bit of an oddball, a bit eccentric, but quite ahead of his time, because he felt, even in the 80s, that every public place should have a defib. What do we have now? We have defibs all over the place. So some people are eccentric and a bit off the wall, come up with good ideas. So there's John Goodall, he was a physician, Nigel Beresford, who was a GP in Lochs, Ian Lawson, who's in the opposition in the health centre, the Springfield practice, George Gray, the late Alistair Barden. I remember him coming back for one mission. He had a boyish grin on his face, as he always did. And he said to the patient who had a broken ankle, he said, "I hope you want to go to Stornoway." Bloke said, "Why?" He says, "Well, because that's where we're going." Same problems as we have these. People want to be flown to somewhere convenient, whereas the aim of the crew is to get the helicopter back on base, readied in case it's called out again. Andrew Hotherall in the audience, anaesthetist, joined us, and for a while we had George Campbell, a paramedic. But everyone went to great lengths to avoid. John retired, Nigel went down to London, Ian went off to the Antipodes, George went down to run a hospice in Glasgow. Sadly, Alistair Barden lost his life in his gyrocopter accident. Andrew retired, and George Campbell also went to the Antipodes, which just shows how far people go not to be on a search and rescue helicopter. And then there was one, that was me. So I said, yep, I'll carry on doing it on a voluntary basis if I'm available, and I can make it, I'll be there, because if you're on call for the practice, you couldn't abandon the practice. So the support of my partners in the practice, support of the wife, calls were often at night. Weather was always great, wasn't it, Chris? Yes, excellent weather. We also had good weather. So I did put round for any volunteers, but funnily enough, getting out of a warm bed to go onto a plane at silly o'clock in the middle of the night never seemed to attract any volunteers. But when they phoned, I turned up. It wasn't until they did a documentary for NHS Hero that it dawned on me that from bed to air was usually about 15 minutes or less. You think, a bit speedier than the average Logan Air check-in. But in those days, it was it was first aiders with extended training, and they used to get there, do their mission planning, and then no doubt someone would think, this one sounds ill, let's call Brian. So by the time I arrived, it was rotors running, my kit was on board, all I had to do was dump the car for the engineers to park and jump on board. I should have said at the beginning, I'm medical director for Bristow UK Search and Rescue. I was previously medical director for CHC Search and Rescue, but anything I say are purely my own opinion and not any company's opinion or anybody else. And we all think that search and rescue, civilian search and rescue started in 87 up here. Well, it started in 1971 when Whirlwind helicopters was replaced in Manston in Kent. 1987, just before I got here, there were 4 bases. That's the 61 Mike uniform. That's the lifeboat. Great fun, these things. I did one training onto the back of the lifeboat because helicopters need a bit of wind through their rotors to keep them up. And when you're training, you'll always have single engine capabilities. If one engine fails, the pilot can recover it. Looking as you go down on the end of the wire, the boat, you're gradually gaining on them at 1 or 2 miles an hour. If you take your eye off the ball and look at the water, you suddenly realize the damn thing is doing 18 to 20 knots. And the service expanded until 2007. And in April 2015, Bristol commenced UKSAR, opening new bases, taking over from the RAF and Royal Navy. So they provided, it's a civilian provided search and rescue, which is on contract or with His Majesty's Coast Guard. And that's the newer S92. Current helicopters, that's the Newquay 92, and that's the St Athan AW189, Sikorsky and Augusta Westland. Nice pieces of kit. I like the 92. I like the 61, but the 92 I like. Didn't like the smaller. I did get a winch out. The only helicopter I haven't been winched out of is the 189. I've been out of the 139, out of the 92, out of the 61, but I haven't done the 189 yet. So maybe that's something to see if we can wangle. So 92, good workhorse. 21 people you can get on board. Any more than that, it just doesn't get up. Endurance over 4 hours, can do 268 nautical miles, has an icing protection system and a twin hoist system and a medical suite. Well, yes, lots of medical equipment on board. The twin hoist is interesting because if you're down on the hoist and it fails, you're a bit stuck. They can cut the wire, but then you're very stuck because they'll leave you. I was actually the first person to do a twin hoist change for real when China Wright was the winch op. Because they put me down, the winch juddered, and so they sent down a second hook for me to swap over and pull up. So that's one thing that happened just as it happened. And the 189, a smaller helicopter, 16 people, 4 hours range, 200 nautical miles, and the same icing protection, twin hoist and medical suite. The helicopters are well equipped. They're built for the job. Landing lights, controllable spotlights, you get a couple of millions of candlewatt power. A controllable spotlight for the crew to search with, 2 down lighting scene lights, LED cluster side lights. And there's lighting power that you do get in a helicopter. And it has, the pilots are now trained on night vision goggles, so it turns that into that. But there are problems with night vision goggles. They're not always the answer to every difficult way into mountains or hills, but they help. And the RAF came in one night and picked me up to do a job. Can you come out? Yeah, RAF will pick you up. Okay, it's a helicopter. Fair play, a good safety briefing on the way in. And they were going to refuel in Benbecula. Perfectly good serviceable airport. And they asked the air traffic controller to turn out all the lights so they could go in on their night vision goggles. So I'm sitting there and they're going in and it's total pitch black. They're all right, they can see where they're going. I just sit there and they yep. The forward-looking camera is really powerful. The area of interest is just here. There. That is the power of the camera we've got on board, which is brilliant. So, what area do we cover? Search and rescue region for UK extends all the way around from middle of the North Sea out to 30 degrees west. You will not get a helicopter out to 30 degrees west, but it is possible to get out to 15 west, as we'll come to in a minute. Long way out. 10 bases. It's an old map that I stole from somewhere because Manston was sold before Bristow's could get hold of it, and they're now based at Lydd down there. But you can see the various ranges from northerly Sunborough, which is 92, Stornoway down to Newquay, which is 92, and also Humberside, which is 92, and the rest are, Carnarvon was 92 as well. And there's a good bit of overlap throughout the country. Availability is 24/7/365, and it covers all UK SAR incidents. How far can you get? This map's on my wall. That is 15 west. When I was doing Merchant Navy medicals once, an ancient mariner, as I like to call him, he was in his late 70s, he came in for his Merchant Navy medical. A retired master, he used to like to go to sea for a couple of months a year to earn some pin money to supplement his pension, or maybe to get away from the wife, you never know. And he said, "Did you put your clocks back an hour out there?" And I said, "Oh, no, we weren't going to be out there for that long." The only reason we could get out there is because the Jack Bates rig was exploring somewhere around about here. So it was a fly out, pick up the casualty and fly back. There's Kilda, another popular visiting site, nearly as popular as Barra. And there is Rockall, which I have never even seen, because every time I've been out there, the weather's been rough, or it's been middle of the night. You can also get out to 15 west there. That is a long way in a 91. Come down into Sligo, refuel, round to Black Rock, out 15 west. Yes, twice. So what's it all about? This is how it happens. Up here, you've got the winch op, pilots in there, winchman, now winchman paramedic down there. And the trick is, with teamwork, the pilot fixes on his points of reference on the boat. The winchman's looking down the wire, guiding forward, left or right. It's unusual that they go on the front of the boat, but as you can see, back of boats tend to be cluttered and fairly inaccessible. And the winch man is giving the winch op instructions as to what height you'd like, up, down, or happy at this height. I did go onto the front of one boat, and you hang it on a wire, not much of me, and there's tens of thousands of tons of steel coming towards you, and it just feels odd. Yes, you know you're not going to be run over by it, but stop. And obviously the casualties down here, and then you reverse the process with the winchman giving the thumbs up when he's ready to go back upstairs. This is a more usual approach at the rear end of a boat, and you can see the winchman's happy with his height, but this is a view just from the side of the wire. And when you do get on, yes, there's clutter everywhere. Every trip hazard, every sharp object, anything you think you can get bashed on, you will. This chap's holding a high line, because obviously gravity, winchmen come down vertically, but sometimes they can't get a good position off over the boat, so you need someone on the deck to pull in. The trouble is that mariners will automatically, if you give them a line, they'll want to tie it onto something to make sure they don't lose the end of it. You don't want to tie a lightweight helicopter that basically could be opened with a pair of tin snips to something that size. Sometimes you end up down on cliffs. Yes, high winch signals over 100 meters change from the single hand to two-handed. And I had an unfortunate occasion when I trapped me nuts on the way down because the harness tightened up on them. Chris was on the beach in Babel when I went down on the rock. And of course, as you go down, quite rightly, the idea is that you don't put your winchman out at 200 foot, because it's a long way down if anything goes wrong. You go out at 40 foot and you fly in, and as you let out the winch, the helicopter comes up. So you're staying about the same height. Of course, I was there like that. Two-handed signal, that means I'm happy with my height. I wasn't happy with my nuts, but I was happy with my. I was numb for about a month around there where it had trapped the inferior epigastric nerve. And Terry Freeman, when I got on board, helpfully said, "Oh, it's all right, you just turn yourself upside down and you can trigger yourself." Great, thanks. Glad to know that now. And glad you're here, Chris. Another one of our jobs. Sensible climber, but people who are sensible people have bad days. He had a bad day. He was climbing up and his attachment to the rock, I'm not a climber, I don't know what he was doing, gave way and he fell down and he pushed his hip right back up through his pelvis, shattering both. So not a keen guy, not a happy guy. And down there is about a 400 foot drop. So you're working in fairly tight proximity. His mate was an annoying person. First of all, he starts challenging us. Like, can't say that. I said, yeah, well, we're here because you've got it wrong. Then his biggest worry was, oh, you mustn't cut my little pretty pink rope. If that snags and pulls the winch off, none of us are going anywhere, especially the bloke who's got a broken hip. It'll be a long carry off from there. Anyway, he got up, and that's us waiting to be collected. But as you can see, the clouds are coming in, and had they closed right in, it would have been a very long walk home. On the way out, we walked along here. I was carrying the Intnox cylinder until we got out to see him somewhere just a bit off screen. Technical crew. The old days are called rear crew, they're now called technical crew, and they're not just paramedics. They're not just aviators. First of all, they're aviators. You've got to get the helicopter out to where you want. You've got two very skilled pilots at the front, and you've got two very skilled aviators at the back, one of whom's a winch operator and tends to be a technician, the other a paramedic and winch man. So, as you can see, it can get quite choppy out there. Once you've got to where you want to be, you then turn into a rescuer. Now, I've been lucky because I've gone down the rope many, many times, but whenever I go down on a wire, the winchman has always been down there before me. When they go down into some situations, they are absolutely appalling, weather-wise, risk-wise, environment. Once they're down, they then turn into a clinician, and then there's back to the age-old, do you do everything on scene, or do you move off? So how much time? The old days when paramedics first came in, there's the load and go. If you think of the traditional ambulances, load in, off we go, scoop them up, off we go. Then it became stay and play. And this pendulum swings, and it has continued to swing and will continue to swing. Should you spend more time on scene or less time on scene? So they're clinicians as well as rescuers and aviators. I think it's worth mentioning HEMS here. It's not a competition between search and rescue and HEMS, although at times you sometimes wonder whether there's a willy waving in high visibility going on. They fill distinct and complementary roles. As the environment becomes more hostile, the geography becomes more difficult, the weather becomes more difficult, SAR is the asset you require. As the patient becomes more critically ill, HEMS is the asset you require, and they often have doctors on board. These doctors are intensivists or anaesthetists who've got all the skills. For example, intubating someone. If someone is alive and they're got a gag reflex, to get a tube in, you have to sedate them and paralyze them, then put a tube in. If you take their airway away and you render them with no respiration, you have to get that fixed. Tube has to go in. The Sydney HEMS, when I went out there, have this lovely thing. You used to call it keto rocket. Ketamine followed by rocuronium. That was their preferred thing. Integration is the key for all emergency services, and quite often you'll see that the search and rescue helicopter is able to rescue someone to the top. When they're critically ill, they can pass them on if the HEMS helicopter is waiting up there. That said, it's all emergency services. There are land-based ambulances, fire rescue crews, Coast Guard crews, lifeboat, and if everyone works together, especially with the tasking, and tasking is through His Majesty's Coast Guard. And if you're calling for help, it's better to give a good explanation of what the situation is, and let these guys decide what the best asset to mobilize is. Because it's too easy to say, I want. And a helicopter, although it seems to be like some magical thing that can fly anywhere, is not necessarily the correct asset for the occasion. So that poor sod who'd fallen off, that's him there. That's Chris. That's me. And as you can see, it's quite cluttered. The kit's out, the sandpiper bag's there. That's the dispatch. If you go anywhere near the door, you put that on so you don't fall out and become the next casualty. S61 in Stornoway and Sunborough were the workhorses. A139 in Portland. There are 4 bases. Laterally, these were run by CHC, and this was still run by Bristow. Rear crew tend to be recruited from the military. The RAF did a training course, then there's one in Portsmouth. And this was before the HCPC, which is the Healthcare Professions Council, which now paramedics have to be registered like doctors. It's a registrable title, and you can't just set yourself up. First aid plus cannulation skills, and it was cardiac arrest and pain relief was NOx. Now there are 10 bases, as you saw earlier. Paramedics are recruited as technical crew. There's a paramedic winchman and a technician winch op. Training providers HCPC registered, so your training providers registered as well. There's a paramedic scope of practice. I won't run through all the drugs. Penthroxin, inhalation anesthetic, ketamine, we use intranasal and intramuscular, morphine, additionally tranexamic acid to help stem bleeding. There's midazolam. We've got antibiotics for compound fractures. And as it goes on, so more and more is added on the list. This is all overseen by a medical steering group or committee, which I chair, and the aim is to ensure high quality clinical governance. And the importance is we have to have everything regulated and governed. We don't want somebody going off thinking, I can do this or I can do that. I won't bore you to death with governance. One of the best write-ups I got was when I presented clinical governance back in the early days, back in the 90s, down at Leon Solent, and there was included in the audience was an anaesthetist who said at the end, do you know, that's the first time I've actually understood clinical governance. It was a new concept then. So if you can teach it, you probably know what you're talking about. Institute of Engineering, I thought an equation might be good for the engineers. They like equations. QC3, you need to be qualified. For the pilots, they get their qualification. For the paramedics, they get theirs. You then need to be competent. And all the paramedics we have go through a preceptorship so that we know that they've got time on the job. And let's be honest, it's a bit like qualifying in anything. You qualify and then you're flying solo, or if you're out here, very solo. Then you have to remain current, and there's regular checks on currency, both for the aviation side and for the medical side. And when you have those, you can then turn around and reassure the customer, which in this case is the Coast Guard, that you have and can provide capability. This came from one of my medicals. I used to do medicals for pilots. And Tricky Dane, when he came in for his medical, used to give me a tutorial. I examined him, he gave me a tutorial. There was always something on flying that he updated me on, which was very good. The only time I caught him out was after the German wings disaster, when he came in a year later and said, "You didn't ask about my psychological well-being." I said, "Didn't I?" And I recounted everything I'd asked him at his previous medical. Because at that time he was under a fair amount of workload being the training manager for all the pilots. And he said, "I never realised." I thought, no, because if I told you I was going to do a psychological assessment, shutters up, eyes down, not talking. Clinical governance in aviation, you've got to remember it's a helicopter company. So they understand helicopters, they understand aviation, they understand pilots, engineering. Clinical, nah, too difficult. Fortunately, what we've done now is we've got the clinical governance, reporting systems, and everything integrated into the company system, which is good because what it means is that clinical incident reports come back to us, and fair play, aviation, unlike NHS, is very good at reporting all incidents. But really, the engineers don't want to know about our clinical instance of a broken suction machine or something that didn't happen in the packaging or whatever. And likewise, we don't want to know about theirs. Pilots need to start early. This is the granddaughter. If you look at her, she's got her eye on something better than a £1 million helicopter. Definitely a future crofter. Now he's a real pilot, Big Mac. You have to choose your pilots carefully. I'll give you some tips. As it happens, Big Mac and Dave Tink are two pilots where I'd done their medical on the same day as I ended up flying behind them. Talk about skin in the game. Now, tips for finding a good pilot. First of all, always fly with a pilot who's got the same number of landings as takeoffs. I think that's essential. Well, what sort of landing do you want? Well, it's basically two types. Excellent landing is where you use the plane again. A good landing is where everybody walks away. Certainly the Hudson River landing came into that category. Delta wing landing on its roof didn't quite. So very important to choose your pilots carefully. And the other thing is I always used to make it a point of never telling the pilots where to go. No, I'm not talking about a two-word tutorial on sex and travel. There's always a where do you want to go? And if you start demanding of a pilot and you put him into a place he doesn't want to go, eventually you'll run into problems. I remember picking one person up when we were out far west, and they said, "Do you want to go to Glasgow or Stornoway?" I said, "Look, just keep flying east for about 10 minutes while I assess them, and then I'll tell you whether to turn left or right." I have had the privilege of awards. First one was the Chief Coast Guard Commendation in November 22 for the Nushka, which was 278 nautical miles out. That's the one out at 15 West. I was quite sorry for the wee fella because he was a Somalian who put his hand through the fish skinner. But this was a Monday, and he put it through on Friday. Life is cheap out there. It's all about the bottom line for fishing. And then the crew in Stornoway put me forward from an MBE, and I was pleased to receive that. I received it in the 54th year of Her Majesty's reign. I'm here less than just over a third of a century. Long way to go to catch up with her. Some other accolades. When I was handed the award by the Chief Coast Guard, don't mind me saying, you're not much of a man for this one. I was the smallest one there, as usual. Chris has had many problems seeing me flap around on the end of the wires. Dave Tink was put me on one of the early ones going across the Sylvan. And he had to fly halfway across it to get me on because a squall, 50-knot squall came along, and I was out here taking a quick photograph of the rear wheel. So I reminded John about this when I saw him again. He came up a second time. He still hadn't changed his opinion. And the Stornoway flight knew me as 9 stone ring in wet, which I'm pleased to say I'm still 9 stone. Lots of wet now. And the family, very kindly, for his 60th birthday, got me a cake, like uniform. That's me, obviously, all too much on the stretcher, and that's my MBE. The trouble is, everybody thinks helicopters and their crews are indestructible. They're not. And I did work with Billy Deacon, who was washed off in the Hebrides incident off the Green Lily boat and lost his life. He was known in the Cabernet where he used to live as Mr. Tidy, because the housekeeping service never had anything to do in his room. It was always spotless. And I did work with him on one occasion. Oh, he was anxious. Not for the job. He's never worked for the doctor. He said, oh, I don't know what to do. I said, well, I'd ask you. He said, what if I don't know what it is? I said, well, I'll find it myself. And, you know, you learn to work. So, great man, sadly lost, but I am pleased to say they do have a Search and Rescue Award trophy, which continues on. If you go on the net, you can get more details. How are we doing for time? 10 past, not too bad. Well, let's be honest, it's too important to take seriously. St Kilda. When we first started, we used to refuel the 61 on there. Now, I don't know much about flying, except that how to choose a pilot. But when you take off, as you go forward, the air cushion leaves and you go down. And if you're in Kilda and it's windy, the wind in certain directions come up over the hills and want to blow you back down into the Oggie. So we had refueling there. One was an overnight. Getting in was fine, although the beach had gone AWOL, as it tended to in winter. They put a Land Rover and a bulldozer with headlights on, so the pilot, Alan Tink, that's son of the one that had trouble landing me on the Sylvan, could fly in. On the way out, you've got Black Rock, and Black Sea, and the pilot has no points of reference. So, the deal was, if he was going to make it to first light, which he did, then they weren't going to fly out. On the overnight, my wife was 39 weeks pregnant with our youngest. She didn't deliver, thank goodness. I'd have been in deep, deep trouble. Had a few twinges, but didn't deliver. The 100th mission, I think, 100th, maybe close to that, was the nurse on Kilda taking her own ECG. Said, you've had a heart attack. I did wonder whether I should have grabbed a bunch of the clot-busting drug tenecteplase, but I think by the time to get that mobilised anywhere near, we'd have lost any benefit from getting out there. And I even had an unexpected reunion when I was down in the Grimner surgery in Benbecula. This bloke stopped me in the corridor and said, do you remember me? Nope. He said, you got me off Kilda. I do remember he had a nasty GI bleed. An interesting job was, you don't find the submarine, it finds you. We were tasked out to one of the British submarines, and it just gave a course to fly. And they said, we'll come up when we find you. So we just set out on a course. The Coast Guard operators certainly deserve a mention. because if ever I was caught out, I'd get them to pass on the bad news to home. Sorry, the dinner guests we had tonight, won't be home for them. Oh, no, won't be able to collect the outlaws from the ferry. So they took the response, not me. Global outbreaks, Ebola and COVID suddenly came up as a complete surprise, especially the Ebola, because I got a phone call at silly o'clock while I was in Australia with the daughter. And we were in bed and the phone went, and it was Big Mac. I said, no, can't say that. That's not going to be a policy. So I wrote a policy for Ebola and hemorrhagic fevers while out there. Years later, someone senior in the Coast Guard actually said to me, did you realise your policy was almost identical to the military? I said, no, because I just had to make this up on the hoof, but it worked. And the COVID one, you thought you'd covered every circumstance, and then the medical manager, would phone up on a Sunday and say, this is what we've got, and you'd have to think your way through how you manage that COVID. COVID was important because you had to de-roll the aircraft, so it was stripped out of non-essential equipment. You had to make sure the crew were safe, because at the beginning, there was always the worry that you would end up losing a crew. So yeah, huge complex logistics to get that sorted. And then I obviously became the doctor for Bristow's, because you get calls from all over the world. Can you tell me about? We managed. The trip off Ireland, that was a kidnapping. Honestly. 7:30 in the morning, came out, after liftoff, when we were flying. Then it was mentioned you probably won't be home till tea time. We got home at 5:30 that night. Probably the longest home visit I've done, if you argue that the boat was this guy's home for a while. The Yeoman Bridge, those who remember, a salmonella outbreak on there. That was the time when going out, driving up Oliver's Brae that was flooded, because, as I say, it's always good weather. Some noddy tried to challenge me on coming. The fire service persuaded him that I might have priority with the green light on. And I got out there, and the next day Louise Scott joined me. And for all the fancy equipment in the world, there's several people on the board boat who are well. And the basic observations by the next morning, the simple basic observations I'd written down, if they were improving, you could tell who was ill, who was improving. None of the rest of the examination seemed to make much difference. Yeah, don't go on the lifeboat. Yeah. Long-suffering wife, quite happy for you to go flying, but she's not keen on things that float on the sea. So she said, don't mind you flying, but don't go on the lifeboat. Well, I got a call, didn't I? So I went on the lifeboat. And of course, the grapevine was probably a little bit ahead of me by the time I returned. Oh, where have you been? Oh, I said innocently, the Coast Guard called me out, which was true. Where did you go? To Lawson's Bank, because Ian Lawson had discovered a bank that wasn't on the charts till then, which was true. Then the bonus for 10, how did you get there? Well, yes, it's like this scene. When I first started flying, as I say, the winchmen had always been down. I found these winchmen very good because I was going down on the rope. They were doing the hand signals. So, suits me fine. So I just sat there. Getting lower here. I was going to get a dunking unless I used some hand signals and got rightly put in my place. I do the hand signals. The winchman's not there to guide you in. He may not be available. He may be busy. And then it happened one Sunday morning. All went wrong. Didn't quite get on the boat. And as I came back, the boat bucked off. The helicopter came down and I ended up in the water. So we've had a dunking. And the best way of stopping the spin that Steve Branley came up with, I was spinning on because I'm light, especially with the 91. I was just round and round and round. The boat came up, the helicopter went forward, and I went inside of the wheelhouse, like Tom and Jerry style, came down. Brilliant. came back up and said, it's the best way of stopping a spin I've come across yet. And he's going, no, that's not what I meant to do. Challenges, we've had problems with the landing sites since the accident at Derriford, sadly. An old lady got blown over and subsequently died. But the trouble is, landing sites in congested areas, the planners are quite happy to build up, put car parks in, and even with the old RAF, they even would find that there's a block of houses where they used to have a designated landing site. Bariatric patients, people are too big for the standard HEMS helicopters, difficult to transport, especially if lying flat, and we're just not set up. The helicopters aren't set up for it, so this is a problem. Pressure on the ambulance service means that the helicopter gets in, and then there's no one to hand over to. You're in a long queue with all their other emergency work. Another problem. And how much medical technology and intervention do you do? Whilst the list of drugs may increase, these guys are using drugs infrequently. It's not like the HEMS setup where they've got doctors on board, intensivists on board, and they're used to using drugs frequently. We don't. So there's a balance to be struck between having a number of drugs on board that you need, but not trying to have everything. If you think back to when I qualified, Tom Brown and Professor Donald were still trying to invent ultrasound, and in 1979, which should have been about the time I was doing second MBE, their ultrasound they'd worked on in Glasgow didn't happen. Now there are point-of-care ultrasounds that we've trialled on board, where you can actually take the ultrasound device on board, that size, not a whole room full of equipment. Technology moves on. Thank you all very much for listening. I've had 33 years, initially as a volunteer and then as medical director, and it's been an honour to work with all those involved in UK search and rescue, and long may it continue. Thank you.